Sleep and Death. Rudolf Steiner. Just as we cannot solve the riddle of life without considering death, we also cannot break through to understanding the essence of waking consciousness without considering the state we pass through during sleep. Someone who has no feeling for the significance of supersensible knowledge may entertain doubts about this knowledge simply because of its views on sleep and death. We can appreciate the reason for these doubts. There is nothing incomprehensible about it if someone states that human beings are here in order to lead an active and effective life, that purposeful activity depends on being able to devote ourselves to this life, and that delving into conditions like sleep and death can result only from a penchant for idle dreaminess and lead only to empty fantasies. It is easy for people to believe that rejecting such fantasies is a sign of a healthy soul, and that devoting oneself to idle dreaminess is a pathological trait that is present only in people who lack both joy in life and the strength to tackle it, and who are incapable of real, purposeful activity. It would be doing this opinion an injustice to present it as totally false, because there is a certain kernel of truth in it. It is a quarter truth that needs the other 3/4 for completeness. If we attack the 1/4 of it that is true, we will simply arouse the suspicions of those who see that quarter very clearly but have no inkling of the other 3. It must be acknowledged without reservation that investigating what is hidden behind the veils of sleep and death actually is pathological if it leads to weakness and estrangement from real life. Likewise, we must agree that much of what called itself esoteric science in the past, as well as much of what is practiced today under that name, bears the imprint of something unhealthy and hostile to life. But this unhealthy element does not spring from true supersensible knowledge. On the contrary, the real fact of the matter is this: just as we cannot always be awake, when it comes to the real circumstances of life in the broadest sense, we also cannot get along without what the supersensible element can offer us. Life continues while we are asleep, and our forces for the working and creating we do while we are awake gain strength and refreshment from what sleep gives them. This is how things stand with what we can observe in the manifest world. But the world is broader in scope than that particular field of observation, and what we know in the visible world must be complemented and fructified by what can be known about the invisible worlds. If we did not repeatedly draw strength for our depleted forces from sleep, we would destroy our life. Similarly, a worldview not fructified by a knowledge of the hidden element inevitably leads to desolation. Something similar is true of death. Living things succumb to death so that new life can come about. Knowledge of the supersensible element is precisely what can shed light on Goethe's beautiful words. Life is nature's most beautiful invention, and death is a trick it plays in order to have abundant life. Just as there would be no life in the usual sense of the word if there were no death, there can be no real knowledge of the visible world without insight into the supersensible realm. All knowledge of the visible must immerse itself in the invisible again and again in order to be able to evolve. Thus it is evident that the science of the supersensible is what makes the existence of revealed knowledge altogether possible. When it appears in its true form, this science of the invisible never weakens life. It repeatedly strengthens it, and makes it fresh and healthy when it has become weak and sick from having been left on its own. When we fall asleep, the connection between the elements of our makeup changes. The part of a human being that lies sleeping on the bed contains the physical body and ether body, but not the astral body or ego. Life's processes continue during sleep because the ether body remains united with the physical body. If the physical body were left to itself, it would have to disintegrate. What is extinguished in sleep, however, are our mental images, our pain and pleasure, joy and sorrow, our ability to express our conscious intentions, and similar realities of our existence. The astral body is the vehicle of all these, however. If we are unbiased in our assessment of this situation, We will never be able to entertain the notion that the astral body is destroyed during sleep, along with all our pleasure and pain and the entire world of our ideas and will. It is simply present in a different state. For our eye and astral body to have a conscious perception of our pain and suffering and all the other things just listed, rather than simply being filled with them, the astral body must be connected to the physical body and the ether body. And in fact it is connected when we are awake, but not when we are asleep. In sleep, the astral body withdraws. It takes on a different form of existence than the one it has when it is connected to the physical and ether bodies. So the next task for supersensible knowledge is to consider the astral body's other form of existence. As far as observation in the external world is concerned, the astral body disappears during sleep. Now, supersensible perception's job is to follow it until it takes possession of the physical and ether bodies once again when we wake up. As in all cases involving knowledge of the world's hidden things and processes, discovering the particulars of what is really going on in the state of sleep requires supersensible observation. Once what can be discovered by this means has been stated, however, it is immediately understandable to truly unbiased thinking, because processes in the hidden world have effects that are visible in the manifest world. Once we see how the contribution of supersensible observation makes sense-perceptible processes understandable, such corroboration by life itself constitutes the proof that can be required for such things. Those who choose not to use the methods of attaining supersensible perception that will be explained later will still be able to have the experience of accepting the statements of supersensible knowledge and applying them to manifest things in their own experience. By doing so, they will find that life becomes clear and understandable. The more precisely and thoroughly they consider ordinary life, the more they will come to this conviction. Even though the astral body experiences no mental images during sleep, no pleasure or pain or anything similar, it does not remain inactive. On the contrary, it is obliged to maintain a lively activity in the sleeping state, an activity it must take up again and again in rhythmical succession after periods of being involved in the activity that it shares with the physical and ether bodies. Just as the pendulum of a clock that has swung to the left and then come back to the middle must then swing to the right because of the momentum gained by swinging to the left, the astral body and the eye that rests in its bosom, having been active for a while in the physical and ether bodies, must then spend the next period of time being busy and active in the body-free state in an environment of soul and spirit. As far as our normal state of life is concerned, unconsciousness sets in when the astral body and the eye are in this body-free state, because this represents the counterbalance to the state of consciousness that develops in the waking state through union with the physical and ether bodies, just as the pendulum's swing to the right is the counterbalance to its swing to the left. The sole spiritual principle in the human being experiences needing to enter this state of unconsciousness as fatigue. However, this fatigue is the expression of the fact that during sleep the astral body and eye are preparing themselves to reform, during the next period of wakefulness, what has arisen in the physical and ether bodies through purely organic and unconscious, formative activity while they were free of the spirit and soul principles. This unconscious formative activity is the polar opposite of what happens in the human being during consciousness and by means of consciousness. These states must alternate in rhythmical succession. The usual views on the connection between sleep and fatigue are not in line with the facts. We think that sleep sets in as a consequence of fatigue. This is an oversimplified idea, as is shown by the fact that people often fall asleep during uninteresting lectures or on other similar occasions even if they aren't tired at all. Anyone who insists that such occasions make us tired is trying to explain this phenomenon by applying a method that lacks cognitive integrity. Unbiased observation will certainly show us that waking and sleeping represent different relationships of the soul to the body. Like a pendulum swinging alternately to the right and to the left, these relationships alternate in rhythmic succession in the ordinary course of life. This same unbiased observation reveals that the state of being filled with impressions of the outer world awakens within the soul a desire to follow this state with a different one in which the soul is absorbed in enjoying its own bodily nature. Two states of soul alternate, surrendering to outer impressions and surrendering to one's own bodily nature. During the first state, the desire for the second is produced unconsciously. The second state then runs its course in unconsciousness. Fatigue is the expression of wanting to enjoy our own bodily nature, so instead of saying that we want to sleep because we feel tired, we actually ought to say that we feel tired because we want to sleep. Since the human soul can, as a sort of adaptation, evoke at will states that normally appear as a matter of necessity, it is also possible for us to evoke the desire to enjoy our own bodily nature when we have numbed ourselves to a given outer impression. That is, we fall asleep even though our inner condition gives us no reason to do so. The physical body can only be maintained in a shape and form suitable for a human being by means of a human ether body, which must in turn receive the appropriate forces from an astral body. The ether body is the sculptor or architect of the physical body. However, it can only shape the body in the right way if it receives the stimulus to do so from the astral body. The astral body contains the prototypes according to which the ether body gives the physical body its form. During the waking state, the astral body is not filled with these prototypes of the physical body, or only to a certain extent, because the soul puts images of its own in their place. When we direct our senses to our surroundings, we form mental images by means of perception, mental images that are likenesses of the world around us. Initially, these likenesses disturb the images that stimulate the ether body to maintain the physical body. If our own activity were to supply our astral body with images that would stimulate the ether body in the right way, this disturbance would not happen. In fact, however, this disturbance, which is expressed in the fact that the prototypes for the ether body are not fully effective during the waking state, plays an important role in human existence. In the waking state, the astral body carries out its activity within the physical body, while in sleep it works upon it from outside. Just as the physical body, which is of the same nature as the outer world, needs the outer world to supply it with nourishment, for example, something similar is also true of the astral body. Imagine a physical human body removed from the world that surrounds it. It would have to perish. This demonstrates that without its whole physical environment, it could not exist. In fact, the entire earth must be just the way it is if physical human bodies are to exist on it. In reality, the entire human body is simply a part of the earth, or, in a wider sense, part of the whole physical universe. In this connection, its relationship is similar to that of a finger on one hand to the entire human body. If we sever the finger from the hand, it can no longer remain a finger. It withers away. The same thing would happen to a human body if it were removed from the body it is part of, from the living conditions provided by the earth. If we were to raise it a sufficient number of miles above the earth's surface, it would die just as a finger severed from the hand dies. If we pay less attention to this fact with regard to our own physical bodies than with regard to fingers, this is simply because fingers cannot stroll around freely on the body the way people can on the earth, so the dependence of fingers is more obvious. Just as the physical body is embedded in the physical world to which it belongs, the astral body is also embedded in a world of its own. However, it is torn out of this world during our waking life. An analogy will illustrate what happens in this case. Imagine a container full of water. A single drop in this volume of water is not something separate and independent. But then suppose we take a little sponge and absorb one drop out of the whole amount. Something similar happens with the human astral body when we wake up. During sleep, it is in a world that is like itself. In a certain sense, it constitutes something belonging to that world. But when we wake up, the physical body and the ether body absorb it and fill themselves with it. They contain the organs through which it perceives the outer world, but in order to acquire this perception, it must separate itself from the other world to which it belongs. However, it can only receive the prototypes it needs for the ether body from this other world. In the sleeping state, the astral body receives images from the world that surrounds it, just as the physical body receives nourishment from its surroundings. For example, the astral body actually lives out there in the universe, outside the physical and ether bodies, in the same universe that gave birth to the entire human being. This universe is the source of the images we use to maintain our form, and we are harmoniously incorporated into it during sleep. As we awaken, we lift ourselves up out of this all-encompassing harmony in order to acquire outer perception. During sleep, our astral bodies return to the harmony of the universe again. When we awaken, we bring enough strength with us out of the cosmic harmony into our bodies so that we can go without being in that state for a while. The astral body returns home during sleep and brings renewed forces back into our life when we awaken. The outer expression of this is the refreshment that healthy sleep bestows on us. Further esoteric scientific descriptions will show that the astral body's home is more encompassing than the aspect of the physical environment that belongs to the physical body in the narrower sense. While we humans, as physical beings, are part of the earth, our astral bodies are part of a world that embraces additional heavenly bodies. During sleep, therefore, we enter a world that encompasses other worlds in addition to our earth. As mentioned before, this fact will only become clear from later descriptions. It ought to be superfluous to point to a misunderstanding that can easily arise with regard to these facts. But this is not the case in an age when certain materialistic ways of thinking are present. Of course, people who subscribe to these views can say that the only scientific thing to do is to investigate the physical conditions of something such as sleep. They can say that even though experts are not yet united on the subject of the physical cause of sleep, one thing is certain: we must assume that specific physical processes are the basis of this phenomenon. If only people would admit that supersensible knowledge in no way contradicts this claim. It agrees with everything that is said from this point of view, just as we all agree that in the physical construction of a house, one brick must be placed on top of another, and that when the house is finished, its structure and the fact that it holds together can be explained in terms of purely mechanical laws. In order for the house to come about, however, the architect's idea is needed, and this idea is nowhere to be found when we investigate only the physical laws that apply. Just as the thoughts of the person who created the house lie behind the physical laws that make it explainable, the statements of supersensible knowledge also lie behind what physical science quite correctly presents. It is true that this comparison, which may be considered trivial, is often used to justify the idea of a spiritual backdrop to the world. But in such matters, the important thing is not that we are familiar with specific concepts, but that we attach the right value to them in arguing the point. The mere fact that opposing ideas exercise so much power over our capacity for judgment can prevent us from assessing this value correctly. Dreaming is an intermediate state between waking and sleeping. To thoughtful consideration, dream experiences consist of a colorful intermingling of images in a world that conceals an element of regularity and lawfulness within it, although at first glance this world seems to reveal an often confusing ebb and flow. In dreaming, we are released from the laws of waking consciousness that fetter us to sensory perception and to the rules that govern our power of judgment. And yet, dreams obey certain mysterious laws that are fascinating and alluring to our faculty of surmising and are the deeper reason why we so readily compare dreaming to the beautiful play of imagination that supports artistic sensitivity. We will find this confirmed if we simply recall a few characteristic dreams. We dream, for example, about driving off a dog that is about to pounce on us. We wake up to catch ourselves in the unconscious act of throwing off the covers where they were weighing on an unaccustomed body part and starting to bother us. What does dreaming do to a sense-perceptible process in this case? Our sleeping life allows what our senses would perceive in the waking state to remain fully unconscious for the moment, but it does hold fast to one essential thing, the fact that we are trying to get rid of something. It spins a pictorial process around this fact. The images as such are echoes of our daily waking life, but there is something arbitrary in the way they are borrowed from it. We have the feeling that although the same external provocation might also conjure up other pictures in our dream, these would still symbolically express the sensation of wanting to get rid of something. Dreams create symbols. They are symbolists. Inner processes can also be transformed into dream symbols. Suppose we dream that a fire is crackling nearby. We see the flames in our dream. We wake up and find that we have been too warmly covered and are getting hot. The feeling of too much warmth expresses itself in the dream image. Very dramatic experiences can be enacted in dreams. We dream, for instance, that we are standing at the edge of a cliff. We see a child running toward the edge. The dream lets us experience all our tormenting thoughts. If only the child would pay attention and not fall over the cliff. We see the child fall and hear a dull thud as the body lands. We wake up and find that something hanging on the bedroom wall has fallen down with a dull thump. In the dream, this simple process is expressed in exciting images. At the moment, we need not wonder about how it is possible for the momentary dull thud of a falling object to trigger a whole series of events that seem to take place over a certain span of time. We only need to consider how the dream makes an image out of what sense perception would offer if we were awake. We see that as soon as our sensory activity comes to a halt, something creative asserts itself in us. This is the same creativity that is also present in completely dreamless sleep, where it appears as the soul state that is the opposite of the waking state. In order for this dreamless sleep to set in, the astral body must have withdrawn from the ether body and the physical body. During dreams, it is separated from the physical body in that it is no longer connected to our sense organs, but it still maintains a certain connection to the ether body. That we can perceive the astral body's processes in image form is due to this connection. When it ceases, the images immediately sink down into the darkness of the unconscious, and we have dreamless sleep. That dream pictures are arbitrary and often absurd is due to the fact that the astral body is not able to relate its images to the right objects and processes in our external surroundings because it is separated from the physical body's sense organs. This state of affairs becomes much clearer when we consider a dream in which the eye seems to split into two, for instance when someone dreams of sitting in a classroom and being unable to answer a certain question, which the teacher then answers immediately. In this case, the dreamer cannot make use of the physical body's organs of perception and is therefore not in a position to relate these two occurrences to one and the same person, namely his or herself. In order for each of us to recognize the enduring I in ourselves, we must first be equipped with organs of outer perception. This enduring I would only be perceptible to us outside the physical body if we had acquired the ability to become aware of it in some way other than through these organs of perception. It is up to supersensible consciousness to acquire the faculties needed for this. We will talk about the means of acquiring these faculties later on in this book. Death, too, occurs only because of a change in the relationship between the elements of our makeup. Here again, the effects of what supersensible perception describes can be seen in the manifest world, and if our power of judgment is unbiased, we will be able to confirm the communications of supersensible knowledge by observing outer life. However, in this case the expression of the invisible and the visible is less apparent, and it is more difficult to fully recognize the significance of how the processes of outer life confirm what supersensible knowledge communicates. To those who refuse to understand how the sense perceptible contains a clear indication of the supersensible, claiming that these communications are mere figments of the imagination seems even more natural than saying the same of many things that have already been discussed in this book. During the transition to sleep, the astral body is simply released from its connection to the ether body and the physical body, which remain connected to each other. At death, however, the physical body also separates from the ether body. The physical body is given over to its own inherent forces. As a corpse, it must disintegrate. After death, the ether body, however, finds itself in a condition that it never experienced between birth and death, except under certain exceptional conditions that will be spoken of later. It is now united with the astral body, but without the presence of the physical body, because the ether and astral bodies do not separate from each other immediately after death. It is easy to understand the need for the force that holds them together for a time. If that force were not present, the ether body would not be able to extricate itself from the physical body at all. In sleep, for example, they are held together, and the astral body is incapable of tearing them apart. The requisite force takes effect at death, severing the ether body from the physical body so that the ether body is now connected with the astral body. Supersensible observation shows that this connection is different in different people, but lasts for a matter of days. For the moment, this time period will be mentioned only as a point of information. Later, the astral body separates from its ether body and continues on its way without it. While these two bodies are still connected, we are in a state that allows us to perceive the experiences of our astral body. As long as the physical body is present, the work of restoring its worn-out organs must begin from outside as soon as the astral body is released from it. But once the physical body has been cast off, this work is no longer necessary. However, the force formerly used for this purpose during sleep persists after death and can now be used to make the astral body's own processes perceptible. If our processes of observation cling to life's externalities, we may still say that these are all claims that may be clear to those gifted with supersensible sight, but for everyone else there is no possibility of arriving at the truth of the matter. This is not the case. After supersensible knowledge discovers something in this or any other domain that is removed from ordinary perception, it can be grasped by our ordinary power of judgment. We must simply give the right consideration to relationships in life in the manifest world. The relationships among thinking, feeling, and willing and their relationship to our experiences in the outer world remain inherently incomprehensible as long as the character of their revealed activity is not seen as the expression of an unrevealed activity. This revealed activity becomes transparent to judgment only when the activity and the course it runs in the physical life of a human being can be seen as resulting from what supersensible knowledge concludes about non-physical things. If we confront this activity without benefit of supersensible knowledge, it is as if we were in a dark room with no light. Just as we see the physical objects in our surroundings only when light is present, what takes place in our soul life becomes explainable only in the presence of supersensible knowledge. As long as we are connected to the physical body, the outer world enters our consciousness in the form of images or reproductions. But after we cast that body off, we begin to perceive what our astral body experiences when it is not connected to the outer world by physical sense organs. At first, the astral body has no new experiences. Its connection to the ether body prevents it from experiencing anything new. However, it does possess a memory of the life that is just over. The still present ether body allows this memory to appear as a comprehensive living picture, so our first experience after death is a perception of life between death and birth as a series of images spread out in front of us. During that life, memory was present only during the waking state, during union with our physical bodies, and only to the extent that these physical bodies permitted. But nothing that makes an impression on the soul during life is ever lost to it. If the physical body were the perfect instrument for this, it would be possible at any moment in life to make our entire life appear to the soul. At death, the physical body's hindrance disappears. As long as the ether body persists, a certain perfect memory is present, but this disappears to the extent that the ether body loses the form, similar to the physical body, that it had while dwelling in that body. This is also the reason why the astral body separates from the ether body after a while. It can only remain united with an ether body whose form still corresponds to the physical body. During life between birth and death, the ether body separates from the physical body only in exceptional instances, and only for brief periods. For example, a portion of the ether body can separate from the physical because of excessive pressure on one of our limbs. In this case, we say that the limb in question has gone to sleep. That peculiar feeling comes from the separation of the ether body. Of course, this is another opportunity for a materialistic view of things to deny the presence of the invisible in the visible, saying that this all stems from the physical disturbance caused by the pressure. In a case like this, supersensible observation can see how the corresponding part of the ether body slips out of the physical. If a person experiences extreme fright or some similar unusual shock, the ether body may separate from the greater part of the physical body for a very short time. This happens if, for whatever reason, we suddenly find ourselves near death, on the verge of drowning, for example, or in danger of falling while rock climbing. The accounts of people who have experienced such things actually come very close to the truth and can be confirmed by supersensible observation. They state that in such moments their entire lives passed in front of their souls like a great picture in their memories. Of the many examples that could be given here, only one will be referred to because it comes from a man whose personal philosophy would consider everything said about such things here to be sheer fantasy. For those who have made a few steps in the direction of supersensible observation, it's always very useful to become familiar with such accounts by people for whom supersensible science is mere fantasy, since it is not so easy to attribute these accounts to bias on the part of the observer. It is to be hoped that spiritual scientists will learn a great deal from those who consider their efforts ridiculous, and it need not confuse them if their critics do not return their affection. Of course, supersensible observation itself does not aim to verify its own results through such things. It refers to them not in order to prove its findings, but only to clarify them. In his memoirs, Moritz Benedict, an eminent criminologist and well-known researcher in many other fields of natural science, relates a personal experience. Once he nearly drowned while swimming and saw his whole life flash before him in retrospect as if in a single picture. If the images seen by others on similar occasions are described differently, and even seem to have little to do with the events of their past, this does not contradict what was said above. The images that arise in this unusual state of separation from the physical body are often not readily explainable in terms of their relationship to life. However, if they are considered in the right way, this relationship can always be recognized. If someone was once near drowning and did not have the experiences described here, this in no way detracts from the general description. We must keep in mind that these experiences can take place only when the ether body is really separated from the physical body but remains united with the astral body. When the shock also causes a loosening of the connection between the ether body and the astral body, these experiences do not take place because complete loss of consciousness occurs, as it does during dreamless sleep. In the time immediately after death, our experiences of the past appear, combined into a single memory picture. After that, the astral body separates from the ether body and continues its journey on its own. It is not difficult to see that everything the astral body acquired through its own activity during its stay in the physical body now remains in it. The I developed the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit body to a certain extent. To the extent that these have been developed, they do not owe their existence to the organs of the various bodies, but to the eye, which needs no outer organs, either for self-perception or to remain in possession of what it has united with itself. In that case, we might wonder why we have no perception during sleep of the spirit self, life spirit, and spirit body that have developed. The reason for this is that the eye is fettered to the physical body between birth and death. Even when it is with the astral body outside the physical body during sleep, it is still closely connected to the physical body because the astral body's activity is directed toward the physical body at that point. In this state, the eye and its perception are directed toward to the outer sensory world and prevented from receiving the revelations of the spirit directly. Death allows these revelations to reach the eye for the first time, because death frees the eye from its connection to the physical and ether bodies. The moment the soul withdraws from the physical world that lays claim to all of its activity during life, another world lights up for it. Even during this time, not all of our connections to the outer sense-perceptible world have been terminated. Instead, they are maintained by certain desires that are still present. These desires are the ones we create through being conscious of the eye as the fourth element of our makeup. Desires and wishes that spring from the nature of the three lower bodies can only be active in the external world, and they cease when these bodies are discarded. Hunger, for example, comes about through the external body and is silenced as soon as this body is no longer connected to the eye. If the eye had no desires other than those that originate in its own spiritual nature, it would be completely satisfied by the spiritual world into which it is transported at death. Life, however, has given it other desires. Life kindled a longing in it for pleasures that can only be satisfied by physical organs, although these pleasures are not inherent in the organs themselves. The three bodies are not the only elements that expect satisfaction from the physical world. The eye also finds certain pleasures in this world, pleasures that the spiritual world has no means of providing. For the eye, there are two types of desires in life, those that originate within the bodies and must also be satisfied there, coming to an end when the bodies disintegrate, and those that originate in its own spiritual nature. The latter are also satisfied by means of bodily organs as long as the eye inhabits the bodies, since the hidden element of the spirit manifests in bodily organs. Along with everything the senses perceive, they also take in something spiritual. This spiritual element is also present after death, although in a different form. Everything of a spiritual nature that the eye desires within the sense-perceptible world is also still there when the senses are no longer present. If there were not a third type of desire in addition to these two, death would signify only a transition from desires that can be satisfied by the senses to those that find fulfillment in the revelation of the spiritual world. The third type of desire consists of the ones the eye creates for itself during life in the sense-perceptible world because it also takes pleasure in aspects of this world in which the spirit does not manifest. The lowest pleasures can be manifestations of the spirit. The satisfaction a hungry being gains from taking in food is a manifestation of the spirit, because if it did not take in nourishment, the spiritual element would not be able to evolve in a certain respect. However, the eye can also move beyond the enjoyment offered by this necessary state of affairs. It can long for food that tastes good, regardless of how eating serves the spirit. The same thing happens with regard to other things in the sensory world. This creates desires that would never appear in the sense-perceptible world if the human eye were not incorporated into it. Such desires, however, also do not originate in the spiritual nature of the eye. Even as a spiritual being, the eye must have sensory pleasures as long as it lives in a body. The spirit manifests in sense-perceptible things, and the eye is enjoying nothing other than the spirit when it gives itself up to sense-perceptible things through which the light of the spirit shines. The eye will continue to enjoy this like even when sensuality is no longer the medium for the rays of the spirit. In the spiritual world, however, no gratification exists for desires not already inhabited by the spirit in the sense-perceptible world. When death occurs, the possibility of satisfying these particular desires is cut off. The desire to enjoy good-tasting food can only be satisfied when the physical organs used in taking in food are present, the palate, the tongue, and so on. After shedding the physical body, we no longer have these, and if the eye still needs to have these desires satisfied, this need must remain unmet. To the extent that this desire is in accord with the spirit, it is present only as long as the physical organs are there. But to the extent that the eye has created it without serving the spirit, it persists after death as a desire that yearns in vain for satisfaction. We can only get an idea of what then takes place in the human being by imagining that someone is suffering from raging thirst in an area where there is no water far or near. That is how things stand with the eye after death, to the extent that it still cherishes unextinguished desires for the pleasures of the outer world and no longer possesses organs that could satisfy them. Of course, we must imagine the raging thirst that is an analogy for the state of the eye after death as being intensified immeasurably, and encompassing all other remaining desires that cannot possibly be satisfied. After death, the eye immediately finds itself in the situation of having to free itself from the shackles of this attraction to the outer world. In this respect, the eye has to bring about purification and liberation within itself. It must eradicate all the desires that came about in it during life in the body, which therefore have no right to exist in the spiritual world. The world of these desires is dissolved and destroyed after death like an object that is seized and consumed by fire. This offers us a glimpse into the world that supersensible knowledge calls the consuming fire of the spirit. Any desire that is sensual in nature in a sense that is not an expression of the spirit is seized upon by this fire. We might feel terrified and inconsolable when we confront the conceptions of these processes that spiritual science inevitably supplies. It might seem shocking that a hope that needs sense organs for its fulfillment must turn into hopelessness after death, and that a desire that can only be satisfied by the physical world must be transformed into searing deprivation. However, it is possible to maintain this view only as long as we fail to consider that all the desires seized upon by this consuming fire after our death are not beneficial ones in any higher sense but represent destructive forces in life. Through such forces, the eye binds itself more closely to the world of the senses than is necessary for taking in its beneficial aspects. This world is a revelation of the spiritual element concealed behind it. If the eye chose not to make use of the senses to enjoy this spiritual element, it would never be able to enjoy the spirit in this form, in which it can reveal itself only through the bodily senses. However, to the extent that the eye desires the aspects of the sense world in which the spirit does not speak, it deprives itself of the world's true spiritual reality. If sensory enjoyment as an expression of the spirit signifies an elevation and development of the eye, then enjoyment that is not such an expression signifies impoverishment and desolation. If a desire of this latter sort is satisfied in the sense world, its devastating effect on the eye, although present, does not become visible until after death. That is why enjoying such pleasures in life can create new, similar desires, although we are not at all aware that we are enveloping ourselves in a consuming fire. What becomes visible after death is nothing other than what was already present around us during life, and when it becomes visible, its healing, beneficial consequences also become evident. For example, a person who loves someone else is not attracted only to the aspects of the other person that can be experienced through physical organs. However, these are the only aspects that can be said to become inaccessible to perception at death. After death, The aspect of the beloved person for which physical organs were only a means to an end becomes visible. In fact, the only thing that prevents this other, higher aspect from being completely visible is the presence of desires that can only be satisfied by means of physical organs. If this desire were not eradicated, conscious perception of the beloved person after death could not come about at all. Seen in this way, the terrifying, inconsolable conception we might have of post-death events as they are described by supersensible knowledge is transformed into a conception that is deeply satisfying and consoling. The experiences we have immediately after death differ from life's experiences in still another respect. During purification, we live life in reverse, so to speak. We go through everything we experience during life since birth, but in reverse order back to childhood, beginning with events immediately preceding our death. In this process, everything in our life that did not originate in the spiritual nature of the I appears spiritually before us, but we experience its inverse. For example, if a person dies at age 60 but injured someone else in body or soul at age 40, he or she will experience this event again on reaching this point in his or her 40th year on the journey back through life. However, what is experienced this time will not be the satisfaction that came from attacking the other, but the pain the other person suffered as a result. From what has just been described, we can immediately see that the only part of such an incident that can be perceived as painful after death is the part originating in a desire of the I that has its source purely in the outer physical world. In reality, the I not only harms the other person by satisfying such a desire, it also harms itself, but this damage remains invisible during life. After death, however, this whole damaging world of desire becomes visible to the I. The I then feels drawn to every being and thing that once kindled such desires in it so that these desires can be eradicated in the consuming fire, in the same way that they were created. On our journey back through life, all our desires of this sort will have gone through the fire of purification only when we reach the point of our birth again. From that point onward, nothing prevents us from dedicating ourselves completely to the spiritual world. We enter a new level of existence. Just as we discarded the physical body at death and the ether body soon after, the part of the astral body that can survive only in our consciousness of the outer world now disintegrates. For supersensible knowledge, therefore, there are three corpses: the physical, the etheric, and the astral. We discard the last of these at the end of the purification period, which is about 1/3 as long as the time that elapses between birth and death. The reason for this will become clear later on, when we consider the course of a human life on the basis of esoteric science. Just as physical corpses are physically perceptible in the world we live in, for supersensible observation astral corpses are constantly present in the surroundings, having been discarded by human beings who are moving from the state of purification into a higher level of existence. As far as the I is concerned, a totally new state of consciousness sets in after purification. Before death, outer perceptions had to flow toward the I for the light of consciousness to shine on them, but now a world virtually flows outward from within and comes to consciousness. The I lived in this world between birth and death, too, but then it was veiled in sense-perceptible manifestations, only appearing in its real form when the I disregarded all sense perceptions and perceived itself in its own inner sanctuary. Just as pre-death self-perception on the part of the I took place within, in its inner being, the world of spirit in all its fullness is also revealed from within after death and purification. Actually, this world is already revealed as soon as the ether body is discarded. It is simply obscured, as if by a darkening cloud, by all our desires that still turn toward the outer world. It is as if the dark demonic shadows rising from desires consumed by fire were mingling with a blissful world of spiritual experience. And not only shadows, these desires are real beings. This immediately becomes apparent when the eye is stripped of physical organs and therefore becomes able to perceive things that are spiritual in character. These beings appear as distorted caricatures of what we formerly learned about through sense perception. Supersensible observation states that the world of the purifying fire is inhabited by beings whose appearance can be horrible and painful to the spiritual eye. They seem to take pleasure in destruction. Their passion is intent upon an evil that makes the evil of the sense-perceptible world seem insignificant in comparison. When we bring desires of the sort described above into the supersensible world, they appear to these creatures as food that constantly nourishes and strengthens their powers. This image of a world imperceptible to the senses can seem less incredible if we observe a portion of the animal kingdom without bias. To spiritual sight, what is a cruel, prowling wolf? What reveals itself and what the senses perceive in it? Nothing but a soul that lives in and acts out of desires. We can call the outward form of a wolf an embodiment of these desires. If we had no organs to perceive this form, we would still have to acknowledge the existence of the being in question if its invisible desires became visible through their effects, that is, if a power invisible to the eye were prowling around doing everything that can be done by a visible wolf. Now it is true that the beings of the purifying fire are present only to supersensible consciousness, and not to sense perception. However, their effects, namely the destruction of the eye if it supplies them with nourishment, are clearly evident. These effects become visible when justifiable enjoyment escalates to the point of immoderation and excess, for sense-perceptible things would also only attract the eye to the extent that enjoying them is somehow justified in the very nature of the eye itself. Animals are driven to desire only through things in the outer world that their three bodies crave, but human beings have higher desires because a fourth element, the eye, is added to their three bodily elements. But if the eye seeks to satisfy such desires in a way that destroys its own being rather than maintaining and furthering it, this is a result, not of the effect of its three bodies or of its own nature, but of beings whose true form is concealed from our senses, beings who can assail the higher nature of the eye and are capable of arousing desires in it that, although unrelated to sensory existence, can only be satisfied through it. The food of these beings consists of passions and desires that are worse than any animal passions because they are not played out in the sense world but take hold of the spiritual element and drag it down into the domain of the senses. Therefore, the forms of such beings appear much more hideous and gruesome to spiritual sight than the forms of the wildest animals, which only embody passions that are justifiable in the sense-perceptible world. The destructive forces of these beings are infinitely greater than any destructive fury that exists in the sense-perceptible animal kingdom. In this way, supersensible knowledge must expand our view to include a world of beings that are lower in a certain respect than any visible destructive animals. Having passed through this world after death, we then find ourselves face to face with a world that contains the spiritual element. The only desire this world arouses in us finds satisfaction in the spirit alone. Here too, however, we distinguish between what belongs to our own eye and what constitutes its surroundings, what we might also call the spiritual world outside of the eye. Now, however, what we experience of these surroundings streams toward us in the same way that our perception of our own eye streams toward us during life in the body. During life between birth and death, our surroundings speak to us through the organs of our bodies, but once we have discarded all our bodies, the language of our new surroundings speaks directly to the innermost sanctuary of the eye. Our entire surroundings are now filled with beings that are similar in nature to our eye, for only an eye has access to another eye. Just as we are surrounded in the sense-perceptible world by the minerals, plants, and animals that make up that world, after death we are surrounded by a world that is made up of beings of a spiritual nature. However, something that is not part of our surroundings there comes with us into this spiritual world, that is, what the eye has experienced in the sense-perceptible world. Immediately after our death, and for as long as our ether body is still connected to the I, the sum total of these experiences appears temporarily in the form of a comprehensive memory picture. The ether body itself is then discarded, of course, but something of this memory picture remains behind as an imperishable possession of the I, as if we had made an extract or distillation of everything that happened to us between birth and death. This is life's spiritual yield, its fruits. Since this yield is of a spiritual nature, it contains everything spiritual that has been revealed through our senses. Without life in the sense-perceptible world, it would not have come about. After death, the I feels this spiritual fruit of the sensory world to be its own inner world through which it enters the world of beings that manifest as only an I can become manifest to itself in its innermost depths. Just as a plant seed, which is the essence of the entire plant, can only develop when it is planted in a different world, namely the soil, what the I brings along from the sensory world now unfurls like a sprouting seed, and the spiritual environment that has received it begins to affect it. It is true that the science of the supersensible can only use images to describe what happens in this land of spirits, but when supersensible consciousness investigates the events, invisible to the physical eye, that correspond to these images, it becomes evident that the images represent a true reality. Comparisons with the sensory world can illustrate what needs to be depicted, since although this other world is completely spiritual in character, it is similar to the sensory world in a certain respect. For example, in the sensory world a color appears when some object acts upon the eye. Similarly, in the land of spirits, an experience similar to the one induced by a color is produced when the eye is acted upon by another being. During life between birth and death, however, the inner self-perception of the I is the only experience that is induced in the same way as this color-like spiritual experience. This is not like light striking us from outside. It is as if another being were acting directly upon the I, causing it to imagine this activity as a colored picture. Thus all the beings in the spiritual environment of the I express themselves in a world radiant with color. Since the way they come about is different, of course these experiences of color in the spiritual world are also of a somewhat different character than sense-perceptible colors, and something similar must be said with regard to the other impressions we receive from the sense-perceptible world. The sounds of the spiritual world are most similar to impressions in the sensory world. The more we live our way into the spiritual world, the more it appears to us as a freely moving vitality that is comparable to tones and harmonies in sense-perceptible reality. However, we do not sense these tones as something that approaches a sense organ from outside, but rather as a force streaming through the I out into the world. We feel the tones the same way we feel our own speech or singing in the sense-perceptible world. But in the spiritual world we know that these tones that are streaming out of us are also manifestations of other beings who are pouring themselves out into the world through us. A still higher manifestation takes place in the land of spirits, when sound becomes the spiritual word. Then not only the movement-filled vitality of another spiritual being but also the being itself communicates its own inner nature to the I. When this happens, when the spiritual word flows through the I, two beings live within each other without any of the separation that is a necessary part of togetherness in the sense-perceptible world. This is really what it is like for the I to be together with other spiritual beings after death. Three distinct domains of the land of spirits appear to supersensible consciousness. They may be compared to three regions in the physical, sense-perceptible world. The first is the spiritual worlds, land masses, so to speak. The second is its bodies of water. The third is its atmosphere. In the first domain of the land of spirits, everything that assumes a physical shape on earth so that it can be perceived by means of physical organs is perceived according to its spiritual nature. For example, the force that gives a crystal its shape can be perceived in the land of spirits, But its manifestation there is the opposite of what appears in the sense-perceptible world, so to speak. To spiritual sight, the space occupied by a mass of rock in the physical world appears as a cavity of some sort, but the force that shapes the form of the stone is seen all around this cavity. The color the stone possesses in the sense-perceptible world appears as an experience of its complementary color in the spiritual world. Thus, from the viewpoint of the land of spirits, a red stone appears greenish and a green one is experienced as reddish. All other characteristics also appear in the form of their opposites. Just as things such as stones and masses of soil make up the sense-perceptible world's land masses or continents, the formations described above constitute the spiritual world's land masses. Everything that is life in the sense-perceptible world is the oceanic region in the spiritual world. To our physical eyes, life is evident in its effects in plants, animals, and human beings. To our spiritual eyes, life is a being that flows, permeating the land of spirits like seas and rivers. Better still, it can be compared to blood circulation in the body, because the distribution of seas and rivers in the sense-perceptible world is irregular, while a certain regularity, like that of the circulating blood, is the rule in the distribution of flowing life in the land of spirits. At the same time, this flowing life is also heard. It resounds spiritually, as it were. The third domain of the land of spirits is its atmosphere. Everything that appears in the sense-perceptible world as feeling exists in the spiritual realm as an all-pervading presence, just like the air on earth. We must imagine it as a sea of flowing feeling. Sorrow and pain, joy and delight flow throughout this domain like winds and storms in the atmosphere of the sense-perceptible world. Let's imagine a battle being fought on earth. Not only human figures with forms that can be seen with physical eyes confront each other here, but feelings confront feelings and passions confront passions. The battlefield is not only full of human figures, it is also full of pain. All the passions, the pain, and the joy of conquest that are active here not only manifest as sense-perceptible effects but also become perceptible to spiritual senses as an atmospheric process in the land of spirits. In the spirit, an event like this is like a thunderstorm in the physical world. Spiritual perception of such events can also be compared to hearing words in the physical world. This is why it is said that wafting spiritual words surround and permeate the beings and events of the land of spirits, just as air surrounds and permeates the beings of earth. Still other perceptions are possible in this spiritual world. Something comparable to the warmth and light of the physical world is also present here. The actual world of thoughts is what pervades everything in the land of spirits, like the warmth that pervades all earthly things and beings. Here, however, we must imagine these thoughts as living, independent beings. What we grasp as a thought in the manifest world is like a shadow of a thought being that is active in the land of spirits. Let's imagine that a thought is extracted from the human being in which it is present, and is endowed with an inner life of its own as an active entity. We then have a feeble illustration of the content of the fourth domain in the land of spirits. What we perceive as thoughts in our physical world between birth and death is merely a manifestation of the thought world, shaped as the instruments of our various bodies permit. But all the thoughts we cultivate that enrich the physical world have their origin in this spiritual domain. We need not think only of the thoughts and ideas of great inventors or geniuses in this regard. We can see how we all have ideas that suddenly occur to us, not merely ideas that are due to the outer world, but ideas we use to transform this outer world. To the extent that we speak of feelings and passions whose causes lie in the outer world, these belong in the third domain of the land of spirits. But everything that lives in our souls in a way that makes creators of us, everything that allows us to transform and fructify our surroundings, is evident in its primal, essential form in the spiritual world's fourth domain. What is present in the fifth domain can be compared to physical light. It is wisdom revealing itself in its primal form. Beings belonging to this domain pour wisdom out into their surroundings like the sun that sheds light on physical beings. A thing that is illuminated by this wisdom shows its true significance and meaning for the spiritual world, just as a physical being shows its color when shone upon by light. There are still higher domains of the land of spirits, but they will be described in a later part of this book. After death, the eye, along with what it brings with it from life in the world of the senses, is immersed in the spiritual world. What its past life yielded is still united with the part of the astral body that is not discarded at the end of the purification period. As we have seen, only the part whose desires and longings are still directed toward physical life falls away after death. Immersing the eye and its past life's yield in the spiritual world can be likened to planting a seed in fertile soil. The seed draws on substances and forces from its surroundings in order to develop into a new plant. Similarly, development and growth are the very essence of the eye that has been immersed in the spiritual world. The force that creates an organ lies hidden within what that organ perceives. Our eyes perceive light, but without light there would be no eyes. Creatures that spend their life in darkness do not develop any organs of sight. Similarly, the whole bodily human being is created out of the forces lying hidden in what is perceived by the organs of our various bodies. The physical body is built up by the forces of the physical world, the ether body by those of the world of life, and the astral body out of the astral world. Now, when the eye is transported into the land of spirits, it encounters these forces, which are hidden to physical perception. In the first domain of the land of spirits, the spiritual beings that always surround human beings, building up our physical bodies, become visible to the eye. In the physical world, what we perceive is nothing other than the manifestations of these spiritual forces that have shaped the human physical body. After death, we find ourselves surrounded by these same formative forces, but now they show themselves in their true forms, which were previously concealed. Similarly, in the second domain we find ourselves in the midst of the forces that make up the ether body, while in the third domain the forces that stream toward us have organized the astral body. What the higher domains of the land of spirits send toward us is also what constitutes our makeup during life between birth and death. From this point onward, these beings of the spiritual world work in conjunction with what we have brought with us as the fruit of our former life, which now becomes a seed. Through their interaction, we are first built up anew as spiritual beings. When we sleep, our physical and ether bodies persist. The astral body and the eye, although outside of these two bodies, remain connected to them. Any influences the astral body and the eye can receive from the spiritual world under these circumstances serve only to replenish the forces we have exhausted while awake. However, after the end of the purification period, when we have discarded not only the physical and ether bodies but also the part of the astral body that still clung to the physical world through its desires, everything flowing from the spiritual world toward the eye serves not only to improve it but also to reconfigure it. And after a certain period of time, spoken of later on in this book, an astral body forms around the eye and becomes capable of living in etheric and physical bodies of the sort appropriate to human beings between birth and death. Then we are ready to undergo birth again and to appear in a new earth existence which then incorporates the fruit of our previous life. Up to the point of forming a new astral body, we witness our own rebuilding. Since the powers of the land of spirits, like our self-aware eye, manifest from within rather than through outer organs, we are able to perceive their manifestations as long as our faculties are not yet directed toward an outwardly perceptible world. However, the moment the astral body has taken shape again, these faculties turn outward. From that point onward, the astral body again begins to demand an external ether body and physical body and turns away from the revelations of the inner world. For this reason, an interim period of sinking into unconsciousness now begins. Consciousness will be able to appear again only in the physical world, when the organs necessary for physical perception have been formed. During this time, when the consciousness illuminated by inner perception has come to an end, a new ether body begins to connect to the astral body, and we can then enter a physical body again. The only eye that would be capable of taking part consciously in reconnecting to these two elements would be one that had succeeded in creating a life spirit and spirit body, the creative forces hidden in the ether and physical bodies. Until we reach this stage, beings that are further along in their development, then we must direct this process of reconnecting. These beings lead the astral body to a set of parents so that it can be given the appropriate etheric and physical bodies. Before the connection to the ether body has been completed, something happens that is extremely significant for us as we enter physical existence again. As we have seen, each of us in our previous life created destructive forces that became evident during our journey backward after death. Let's look again at the example mentioned earlier. In the previous lifetime, the person in question, who was 40 years old at the time, caused pain to someone else in an outburst of anger and later, after death, encountered that other person's pain as a force destructive to the development of his or her own eye. The same is true of all similar incidents in this person's previous life. These obstacles to development then confront the person's eye when it re-enters physical life. Just as the eye saw a kind of memory picture of the past life as death set in, it now has a preview of the life to come. Once again, this person sees a picture of this sort, but this time it shows all the obstacles that need to be overcome in order to make progress along the path of self-development. What is seen in this way becomes the starting point for forces that this person must take along into his or her new life. The image of the pain inflicted on another becomes the force that motivates the eye, on re-entering life, to make up for this pain. Thus our previous life has a determining effect on the new one. In a certain respect, our deeds in this new life are caused by ones in our previous life. We must see this lawful and regular connection between an earlier existence and a later one as the law of destiny. We usually apply the term karma, borrowed from Oriental wisdom, to this law. However, building up a new bodily organization is not the only activity that is required of us between death and a new birth. During this process, we live outside of the physical world. But meanwhile, the physical world continues to evolve. The face of the earth changes within a relatively short period of time. A few thousand years ago, what did the region look like that our country now occupies? As a general rule, when we appear on earth in a new existence, it does not look the way it did during our last lifetime. All kinds of things have changed in our absence. Now, hidden forces are also at work changing the face of the earth. They work out of the world we find ourselves in after death, and we, too, must help to transform the earth. However, as long as we have not become clearly conscious of the relationship between the spiritual element and its physical expression by creating the life spirit and spirit body in ourselves, we require the guidance of higher beings if we are to assist in this transformation, but we do assist in it nonetheless. We can say that during the time between death and a new birth, we transform the earth in a way that aligns its conditions with what is developing within us. If we observe some spot on earth at a certain point in time and again after a long time has elapsed, we find it in a totally different condition. The forces that have brought about this change are present among human beings who have died. This is how they are connected with the earth between death and rebirth. Supersensible consciousness sees manifestations of the hidden spiritual element in all of physical existence. To physical observation, what works at transforming the earth is the light of the sun, changes in climate, and so on. To supersensible observation, however, the forces of people who have died are active in the rays of sunlight falling on the plants. If we observe in this way, we become aware of human souls hovering around the plants, transforming the surface of the earth, and so on. In death, our attention is not focused only on ourselves and on preparing our own new earthly existence. No, we are also called upon to work spiritually on the outer world, just as we are called upon to work physically during life between birth and death. Not only does human life work on circumstances in the physical world from the land of spirits, but the reverse is also true. Activity in physical existence has its effects in the spiritual world. An example can illustrate what happens in this connection. A bond of love exists between mother and child. This love arises out of an attraction between the two of them that is rooted in the sense world, but it changes over the course of time. The sensory bond becomes more and more spiritual. And this spiritual bond is fashioned not only for the sake of the physical world, but for the land of spirits as well. This is also true of other relationships. What is fashioned in the physical world by spiritual beings persists in the spiritual world. Friends who have become intimately connected during life also belong together in the land of spirits. After they have discarded their various bodies, their togetherness is much more intimate than it was during physical life, for as spirits they are there for each other in the same way that spiritual beings reveal themselves to others from the inside, as described above. Also, a bond that has formed between two people leads them together again in a new life. In the truest sense of the word, therefore, we must speak of people finding each other again after death. This process that takes place with human beings between birth and death and then from death to a new birth repeats itself. We return to earth again and again, whenever the fruit of one physical lifetime has ripened in the land of spirits. Yet this repetition does not go on without beginning or end. At one point we left different forms of existence for ones that run their course as described here, and in future we will leave these and move on to others. An overview of these changing stages will be presented later, when the evolution of the cosmos in its relationship to the human being is described from the viewpoint of supersensible consciousness. Of course, the processes that take place between death and a new birth are even more hidden from outer sensory observation than is the case with the spiritual element underlying our existence as it manifests between birth and death. Sense perception can see the effects of this part of the hidden world only where these effects enter physical existence. For sensory observation, the question is whether human beings entering existence through birth bring along something of the processes that supersensible knowledge describes between a death and the next birth. Even if we find a snail shell with no trace of an animal in it, we will acknowledge that the shell came about through the activity of an animal. We will not be able to believe that this form created itself by means of mere physical forces. Similarly, if we observe people during life and discover something that cannot have originated in this life, it is reasonable to admit that it originates in what the science of the supersensible describes, if this sheds clarifying light on something that is otherwise unexplainable. Thus it is also possible for rational sensory observation to understand invisible causes through their visible effects. Any unbiased observer of our current life will find this more and more correct with each new observation. It is simply a question of finding the right point of view for observing effects in outer life. For example, where are the effects of what supersensible knowledge describes as processes belonging to the purification period? How do effects appear that belong to what we are supposed to experience after this period of purification in the purely spiritual realm, according to details provided by spiritual research? If we reflect on life deeply and seriously, there are plenty of riddles that demand our attention in this particular area. We see one person born into poverty and misery, endowed with only meager talents, and seemingly predestined for a pitiable existence because of the circumstances of his or her birth. Meanwhile, another person receives lavish care and attention from solicitous hands and hearts from the first moment of life, develops brilliant capabilities, and has all the potential for a fruitful and satisfying life. We can respond to such questions with one of two opposing points of view. The first one clings to what we can perceive with our senses and understand with our sense-bound intellect. This view does not question the fact that one person is born to happiness and another to misfortune. Even if it doesn't use the term chance, it will not think of assuming that there is some lawful interrelatedness that causes such disparities. And when it comes to potentials and talents, this way of looking at things will attribute them to what is inherited from parents, grandparents, and other ancestors. It will refuse to look for causes in spiritual processes undergone by the person in question before birth, processes that shaped his or her potentials and talents, yet are quite independent of his or her line of descent. However, there is also a second point of view that will feel unsatisfied with this interpretation, insisting that even in the manifest world we do not see things happen in specific places or under specific circumstances without needing to assume that there are reasons why they happen. Even though these causes remain undiscovered in many instances, they are present nonetheless. Alpine flowers do not grow on lowland plains. There is something in their nature that brings them together with alpine surroundings. Likewise, there must be something in a person that causes him or her to be born into a particular environment. Causes that lie only in the physical world are not enough to explain this. To any more profound thinker, assuming that such causes are sufficient would be like assuming that the fact that one person hits another doesn't have to do with the feelings of the person doing the hitting, but only with the physical mechanism of his or her hand. This second viewpoint is equally dissatisfied with any explanation of predispositions and talents as qualities that are merely inherited. Nevertheless, it can be pointed out that certain abilities do run in families. Musical abilities were passed down in the Bach family for 250 years. The Bernoulli family produced 8 mathematicians, some of whom were earmarked for quite different careers as children. But their inherited talents always drove them into the family profession after all. Furthermore, it can be pointed out that exact investigation of someone's line of descent always demonstrates that in one way or another this person's talents were evident in his or her ancestors and are only an accumulation of inherited tendencies. People who hold the second point of view will certainly not disregard such facts, but these cannot mean as much to them as they do to those who want to base their explanations purely on processes taking place in the sense-perceptible world. Adherents of the second view will point out that it is just as impossible for inherited predispositions to assemble themselves into a unitary personality as it is for metal clock parts to assemble themselves into a clock. To the objection that the parents working together can bring about this combination of predispositions, and that this takes the place of the watchmaker, as it were, they will reply, if you look at it impartially, you will find an element in each child's personality that is completely new. This cannot come from the child's parents simply because it was not present in them. Unclear thinking can cause a great deal of confusion in this area. The worst is if adherents of the first viewpoint see adherents of the second as opposing something that is based on positive fact, while it may not even occur to the latter to deny the truth or value of such facts. They, too, see quite clearly that a particular cultural predisposition or spiritual direction is passed down within a family, and that if certain predispositions are combined and accumulate, they can result in an outstanding personality. They are quite capable of agreeing that the most illustrious name almost always stands at the end of a bloodline rather than at the beginning. It should not be held against them, however, if they are forced to hold ideas that are quite different from those of people who choose not to go beyond sense-perceptible facts. These people can be rebutted by saying that individuals certainly do demonstrate certain characteristics belonging to their ancestors, because the element of spirit and soul that enters physical existence through birth derives its bodily nature from what heredity provides. However, this says nothing more than that a being shares the idiosyncrasies of the medium in which it is immersed. Unbiased minds will not deny the justification for the comparison, although it is certainly a strange and trivial one, if we say that the fact that a human being appears clothed in the traits of his or her ancestors says just as little about the origin of this individual's personal characteristics as being wet from falling into the water says about the wet person's inner character. Furthermore, the fact that the most illustrious name stands at the end of a bloodline demonstrates that the bearer of this name needed that bloodline in order to fashion the body that was necessary for the development of his or her entire personality. This proves nothing about the inheritability of the personal element itself. In fact, it proves the exact opposite as far as healthy logic is concerned. If personal talents actually were passed down within a family, they would have to stand at the beginning of a bloodline to be transmitted to the descendants. The fact that they are present at the end, however, is evidence that they are not passed down. Of course, it would be easy to misunderstand the statement that if an individual's personal gifts were simply subject to the law of heredity, they would have to appear at the beginning of a bloodline. We might say, well, they cannot appear there, because they have to develop first. This is not a valid objection, because when we want to prove that something has been inherited from a predecessor, we have to demonstrate that the predecessor's previously existing trait becomes evident again in a descendant. If it is apparent that something is present at the beginning of a bloodline and reappears later on, it would be justified to speak of heredity. But we cannot do this if something that was not present earlier shows up at the end of a bloodline. The reversal of the sentence above was only intended to show that the idea of heredity is an impossible one. This is not intended to deny the fact that those who speak of spiritual causation in life often add just as much to the confusion. They often speak in terms that are much too general and indefinite. If we say that an individual's personality is an accumulation of inherited characteristics, that can certainly be compared to the statement that a number of metal parts have assembled themselves into a clock. But it must also be admitted that many statements about spiritual worlds are no different from the statement that the parts of a clock are incapable of putting themselves together so that the hands actually move, and that therefore something spiritual must be present to make sure this movement happens. Faced with such a statement, we actually have more reason to say, I'm not going to bother any more with these mystical beings that move the hands of the clock. I'd rather find out about the mechanical relationships that make this happen. It is not at all a question of merely knowing that there is something spiritual, the watchmaker, behind mechanical objects, such as clocks. The only significant thing here is to become familiar with the watchmaker's thoughts, which existed before the clock was assembled. We can rediscover these thoughts in the mechanism of the clock. Merely dreaming or fantasizing about the supersensible element never gives rise to anything except confusion because it is unable to satisfy the opponents of spiritual views, who are quite right when they say that such references to supersensible beings in the abstract do not help us understand the actual facts of the matter. Of course, these opponents may also say the same thing about the statements of spiritual science, which are specific and definite. In that case, however, we can point to how the activity of a hidden spiritual element affects our outer life. We can say, suppose it's true what spiritual research claims to have established by means of observation, that during the purification period we undergo after death, our souls experience how specific actions of ours in the previous life hinder our further development, and that while we are experiencing this, we develop an impulse to make up for the consequences of these actions. Let's assume that we bring this impulse with us into a new life, and that it then shapes character traits that put us in a position to make up for what we have done. If we look at the sum total of such impulses, we then have a reason why we are born into certain surroundings as a matter of destiny. The same can be applied to a different assumption. Once again, let's assume that spiritual science is right in saying that the fruits of a bygone life are incorporated into an individual's spiritual seed. and that in the land of spirits where we spend the time between death and a new life, these fruits ripen so that they can be transformed into predispositions and abilities that will appear in that new life, shaping our personalities to reflect the effects of what we have gained from a prior life. If we make these assumptions and use them to observe life in an unbiased way, we will see that they make it possible for us to acknowledge all the realities of the sense world in their full truth and significance. At the same time, they clarify everything that must always remain incomprehensible to those who base themselves strictly on sense-perceptible facts while turning their attention to the spiritual world. And above all, any illogical assumptions will disappear. For instance, the one to the effect that because the most illustrious name appears at the end of a bloodline, the bearer of that name must have inherited his or her talents. The supersensible facts communicated by spiritual science make life logically comprehensible. However, conscientious truth seekers who have no personal experience in the spiritual world but are attempting to chart a course among the facts will still be able to raise an important objection by claiming that it is inadmissible to assume the validity of any fact simply because it enables us to explain something that would otherwise be unexplainable. An objection of this sort is surely totally meaningless for anyone who knows the facts in question as a result of direct supersensible perception. And later sections of this book will indicate the path people can take to become personally familiar with the law of spiritual causation as well as with other spiritual facts that are described here. For those who do not choose to take this path, however, this objection can indeed be significant. Its refutation is also valuable for those who have decided on this path, and for them, accepting this objection in the right way is the best first step. It is absolutely true that if we have no knowledge of something, we should not assume that the thing exists simply because it explains things that would otherwise remain unexplainable. However, in the case of the spiritual facts that have been presented here, the matter is actually quite different. If we assume that these facts are true, we experience not only the intellectual result that life becomes comprehensible, but also something quite different. Let's imagine that something happens to us that causes us considerable pain and embarrassment. We can react to this in one of two ways. We can be distressed about the incident and succumb to feeling embarrassed, or even be overcome with pain, or we can relate to it quite differently, telling ourselves that in a previous life, we ourselves actually created the force that led us to this event. In fact, we've brought this thing upon ourselves. We can then kindle in ourselves all the feelings that are the results of a thought like this. Of course, for it to have such results for all our feelings and sensations, we have to experience this thought with the utmost sincerity, and with all our strength. If we manage to do this, we will have an experience that can best be illustrated by means of a comparison. Let's assume that two people get hold of a stick of sealing wax. One of them makes intellectual comments about its inner nature. No matter how clever these comments are, people can easily retort that this inner nature is pure fantasy if it doesn't show itself in any way. But the other person rubs the sealing wax with a cloth and shows that it attracts small particles. There is a great difference between the thoughts that ran through the first person's mind and prompted his or her remarks and the thoughts of the second person. The first person's thoughts have no consequences for reality, but the second person's thoughts have lured a real thing, an actual force, out of hiding. This is also the case with imagining that a former life has implanted in us the power to encounter a certain event. Simply imagining this arouses a real force in us that allows us to meet the event in a way that is very different from how we would have met it if we had not entertained this thought. The event's inherent necessity dawns on us, whereas otherwise we would only have been able to see it as a coincidence. We will immediately understand that since what we imagined was strong enough to show us the facts of the matter, we must have had the right idea. If we repeat inner processes like this, they begin to be a source of inner strength, and their validity is confirmed by their fruitful consequences. This validity gradually becomes a force to be reckoned with. Such processes have a healing effect on spirit, soul, and body. They foster life in every respect. We become aware that while this allows us to take our place in the context of life in the right way, considering only a single life between birth and death means succumbing to delusion and falsehood. This knowledge makes our souls stronger. Although people can only produce this purely inner proof of spiritual causation for themselves, through individual interactivity, it is possible for everyone to have such proof. However, those who have not produced it for themselves cannot evaluate its power to prove, while those who have produced it will no longer have any doubts about it. This need not surprise us at all. It's quite natural that such an intimate component of our innermost being, our personality, can only be adequately proved by means of the most intimate experience. However, it is not legitimate to object that since such matters conform so closely to inner experience, each person must deal with them individually, and that they are therefore not an appropriate subject for spiritual science. Of course, each person must have the experience for him or herself, just as each person must understand the solution to a mathematical equation. But the way to gain this experience holds good for all human beings, just as the method for solving a mathematical equation is valid for all. Leaving aside supersensible observations, of course, we should not deny that the above-mentioned proof, which is based on the strength-generating force of the thoughts in question, is the only one that will stand up to any unbiased logic. All other considerations are certainly very important, but they all have aspects that leave them open to attack. If we have acquired a sufficiently unbiased view, however, the fact that human beings are educable will constitute logically effective proof for us that there is a spiritual being struggling for existence within the body that envelopes it. We will compare animals to human beings, telling ourselves that an animal's normal characteristics and capabilities appear definitively at birth, clearly showing how the animal's heredity predetermines it, and how it will develop under the influence of the outer world. We can see how a young chick carries out vital functions in a certain way from the very moment of its birth. In human beings, however, upbringing and education establish a relationship between our inner soul activity and something that can exist without any connection to heredity. We are also capable of assimilating the effects of outer influences, and all educators know that such influences must be met by forces coming from within the person in question. If this is not the case, any attempt at education will be in vain. Unbiased educators are aware of a clear-cut boundary between inherited predispositions and the personal inner forces shining through them, which come from earlier lives. It is true that the proofs we can advance for such things are not as weighty as the proofs of certain facts of physics that can be demonstrated by means of a pair of scales. But then, these are subtle and intimate aspects of our lives, and if we have a sense for them, their intangible proofs are as conclusive or more so than tangible reality. The objection that animals can also be trained and can acquire characteristics and faculties through education is not valid to those who are able to see the essentials. Aside from the fact that all kinds of intermediary states exist in the world, the results of training an animal do not fuse with its personal nature in at all the same way as this happens in humans. It has even been stated that the abilities domestic animals acquire through training and through living together with human beings are inheritable. That is, that they work directly on the level of the species rather than on the individual level. Darwin describes how dogs fetch and carry without being trained to do so or having seen it done. Who would make similar claims about human education? There are thinkers whose observations have made them go beyond the idea that human beings are put together from outside by means of purely hereditary forces. These thinkers have worked their way up to the idea that a spiritual being, an individuality, precedes and shapes our physical existence. Many of them, however, do not find it possible to grasp the existence of repeated earthly lives whose fruits are present in the interim as formative forces helping to build up the human being. Let's hear what one such thinker has to say. In his book Anthropology, Emanuel Hermann Fichte, son of the famous Fichte, cites the observations that led him to the following conclusion: in the fullest sense of the word, the parents do not produce the child. They make not only the organic substance available but also the intermediate, sensory soul element that is evident in the child's temperament, unique soul coloring, specialization of impulses, and the like, whose common source is fantasy, in that broader sense that we have already established. Since a unique mixture and union of the parents' souls is unmistakable in all these elements of the personality, it is completely justifiable to explain them as purely a product of procreation, especially if, as we have concluded, procreation is to be seen as an actual soul process. But precisely the crucial central point of the personality is lacking here, for a deeper and more penetrating observation reveals that even these idiosyncrasies of mind and soul are only garments that cloak the child's real spiritual, ideal predispositions, instruments that are capable of furthering or hindering the development of these predispositions but in no way capable of creating them out of themselves. Further on we read, each person existed previously in accordance with his or her fundamental spiritual form. Spiritually considered, no individual resembles another any more than one species of animal resembles another. These thoughts go just far enough to permit a spiritual being to enter our physical bodily nature. However, since this being's formative forces are not derived from causes in previous lives, it would have to arise from a divine primal foundation each time a personality comes into existence. If we assume this to be true, there is no possibility of explaining the relationship that exists between predispositions that work their way out from inside us, and what comes from our outer earthly surroundings and approaches our inner being in the course of life. The inner human being, springing anew for each individual out of a divine primal foundation, would have to be a total stranger to what confronts it in earthly life. For this not to be the case, as in fact it is not, the inner human being must have already been connected to the outer world. It must not be living in it for the first time. Unbiased educators can clearly perceive that they are introducing their students to results of earthly life that are indeed strange to their merely inherited traits of character, yet make them feel as if they had already taken part in the work that produces these results. If we consider the life of present-day humanity from all points of view, the only satisfactory explanation for it is provided by repeated earthly lives and the facts that spiritual research reveals about existence in the spiritual realm between these earthly lives. The expression, present-day humanity, is used quite deliberately here. Spiritual research shows that when the cycle of earthly lives first began, the conditions facing spiritual beings entering their bodily garments were quite different from what they are at present. In the following chapters, we will go back to this primeval state of humanity. Once the results of spiritual science have demonstrated how human beings took on their present form in the context of the Earth's evolution, it will then be possible to point out more precisely how the human being's essential spiritual core comes from supersensible worlds and enters its bodily garments, as well as how human destiny, the spiritual law of causation, develops.